Before introducing our speaker, I want to just mention and remind you all of the Society's summer visit, which will take place on Thursday, the 20th of June, and will be to the special collections and galleries at the University of Leeds. Numbers for this visit are limited, and details can be found now on the Society's website. Today's talk is the annual Graham Pollard Memorial Lecture, established in memory of one of the Society's most distinguished forebears. Pollard, his dates are 1903 to 1976, was a gold medalist and past president of the Bibliographical Society, a prodigious scholar of the book trade, and he was a bookseller himself. A festschrift in his honor was published by the Oxford Bibliographical Society in 1975, and a very appealing account written by Esther Potter entitled Graham Pollard at Work appeared in the library in 1989. Our speaker today is Dr. Geoffrey Day, formerly Fellows Librarian at Winchester College and currently chair of the York Bibliographical Society. For the past 15 years, he and Amélie Jumka of the University of Amiens have been collecting material relating to all aspects of waste paper in the 18th century, from the paper mill to the outhouse, by way of the book trade, the Old Bailey, interior decoration, and the British Museum Department of Prints and Drawings. Their book on this fascinating subject is due to appear later this year from the Bodleian Library Publishing. The title of today's talk is The Preservation and Recycling of Waste Printed Sheets in the 18th Century Book Trade. The talk is being recorded, and at the end, there will be the opportunity for questions. For those following us online, please use the chat function, and we would be grateful if you could give your name for clarity. Please also mute yourselves and turn off the videos. Over now to our speaker, Geoffrey Day.
I'd like to thank the President and the committee for inviting me to give this lecture. And I must also acknowledge the input into this talk of my long-term research partner, Amélie Jumka. Any mistakes are my own. Graham Pollard was writing about the 15th century when he opined that waste paper or vellum can seldom have strayed from the place where it was first considered to be waste. As I hope to show, that is certainly not the case in the 18th century. In 1761, de Lalande estimated that 1 in every 3 sheets in a paper mill failed quality control. From the papermaker's point of view, it was imperative to minimize the economic consequences of such a shortfall. One industry-wide practice was to use lower quality sheets in the cassie quires, which were used to protect the good sheets in the ream in transit. There were 2 cassie quires in each of 24 sheets in every ream of 480, and they were charged as if good. In his mechanic exercises, Joseph Moxon advised printers' warehousemen that before these sheets were consigned to the waste pile, they should sift through the quires and give the least objectionable examples to the pressmen, taking care, however, to give them such paper to be used about the middle of the book, where it would presumably not be immediately seen by a prospective buyer. What may be evidence of this practice is to be found in a copy of Drake's Veracum of 1736, printed by William Bowyer. In this copy, there are 3 inserted signatures, which are from a clearly inferior stock of paper. Can everybody hear? Is that any better? Up more? Is that better? Is that a microphone as well? Right, I'll try. In this copy, there are 3 inserted signatures, which are from a clearly inferior stock of paper. They are heavily discolored, splattered with Vatman's tears, and lack any watermark. Collation with the 12 copies in the York Minster Library show that these signatures are not cancels. The three insertions following Moxon's advice are widely spaced throughout the volume, with signatures O, 5P, and 8U. But not all printers were so surreptitious in the use of substandard paper. Some made a point of advertising the practice, and by applying differential pricing, hoped to attract more purchasers. In 1789, when George III's illness was so severe that the Regency Bill was about to be passed, John Bell saw a commercial opportunity and advertised the King's health at 1 shilling on very coarse paper in order to render it of easy purchase to every individual, while the better copies were available for half a crown. The Fowles Press turned such differentiation into standard practice. In his magisterial bibliography of the press, Philip Gaskell set out his criteria for the classification of the paper quality of their publications. He opted for 5 divisions, ranging from good to medium good and medium, to medium poor, which he defined as rougher papers, often of poor quality, and then poor, which were really bad papers, full of fluff and heavily discolored. Paper from these two latter categories would have been consigned to the waste pile in most other leading printing houses. Gaskell recorded an advertisement for a set of the works of Caesar issue on coarse paper for schools. This market was a major generator of waste paper, as texts were often read to destruction. Thomas Hearn remarked, "Mr. Baker finds that there has been such a book as Linacre's Grammar in English by Buchanan, but being for the use of schools, he presumes all the copies may have been torn and wasted amongst the scholars and not possible to be met with now." A copy of Thomas Dycher's Guide to the English Tongue in the British Library, defaced by Thomas Ollerenshaw of Disley School in Stockport, and possibly also torn by him, bears out Hearn's opinion. Accordingly, it made economic sense to print such text on inferior paper. There appear to be no surviving copies, either of Bell's very coarse King's Health or the Fowles Press coarse paper, these are for schools, and of the more than 275,000 copies of Dycher's English Tongue printed by Charles Ackers between 1733 and 1747, just 6 are extant. What would have been put aside as waste in one printing house was an acceptable and revenue-generating commodity in another. To the waste paper generated in the mills, we must add the sheets wasted in the printing house and from publications which failed to sell. Scholarship has inclined to underestimate both. In his monograph on cancels, which though published nearly a century ago remains a standard text, R.W. Chapman observed, "In the 18th century, it is my impression that one first edition in 3 is likely to contain 1 or more cancels." Gaskell's bibliography of John Baskerville provides precise details rather than impressions. 24 of Baskerville's 56 books have obvious cancels, and the numbers range from 1 to 66. Gaskell's use of obvious cancels is a key, and he added some of the others may have had whole sections cancelled. That regularly replacing entire signatures was indeed a practice in 18th century printing houses is shown by an account of the Fowles Press quoted by Percy Simpson in his study of proofreading. "If any mistake had possibly occurred, we judged it would be most certainly found in the copy of the sheet which had been printed last. So we always reread these final copies with the type still standing, that before it was broken up, by removing any error which had crept in, and by cancelling the whole of the sheet just printed, the entire set might be printed afresh." Simpson remarked, "The astounding thing about this final statement is the firm did not just resort to cancelling leaves, they cancelled the entire sheet. This creates problems. A stub or turnover reveals a single leaf cancel, but there is no corresponding immediately visible indication when an entire sheet has been replaced, though close attention to direction lines may be revealing." Lord Lyttelton's Henry II is almost certainly the most heavily cancelled book in English printing history. In his Lives of the Poets, Samuel Johnson described the work as being elaborated by the researches and deliberations of 20 years and published with such anxiety as only vanity can dictate. And went on, the story of this publication is remarkable. The whole work was printed twice over, a great part of it 3 times, and many sheets 4 or 5 times. Lyttelton's financial situation was such that the stationers refused to keep supplying him with paper, and he asked his printer, William Bowyer, to buy stocks on his behalf. This was most unusual, as major printers operated a just-in-time supply chain, and authors or commissioner booksellers were expected to provide the paper, which, crucially, remained their property. The Bowyer ledgers are full of evidence of the punctilious return of all the sheets wasted during printing. Uniquely, because in the case of Henry II, the paper belonged to the printer, there is a page in the ledgers recording all the waste as a result of cancellation in Lyttelton's book. And on another page, there are details of the sales of waste paper from the book, including rare evidence of a sale of printed waste direct to a shopkeeper for wrapping gingerbread. There is a considerable disparity between the quantity of paper which the recorded cancellations would have generated and the actual sales figures. In an effort to reconcile this disparity, we checked for all the conventional signs of cancellation, volume indicators and signatures in the direction line which did not accord with the normal Bowyer house style, discrepant running heads and pagination, mismatched catchwords. We checked all 7 lists of errata, one of which was solely for errata in the other 6 lists, and found some details being corrected in the body of the text, showing that the corrected leaves had been printed post-errata. These checks added to the list of cancellations, but still did not reach the figures recorded in the sales. Puzzlingly, what we did not find were any examples of stubs or turnovers. The one explanation appeared to be that there were unmarked cancellations in bifolia and entire sheets, as reported in the Fowles Press. At this point, we acquired a first edition with detached boards and had it professionally disbound, returning this text to its unbound sheets. All the sheets were then checked on a light box. What the disbinding revealed was that there were many single-leaf cancels which had been very neatly tipped to their corresponding leaves. This may have been because there were so many such cancels that regular use of stubs or turnovers would have meant the volume would have been far wider at the spine than at the foredge. It may have been because Lyttelton wished to conceal the evidence of his indecision. It must have been a nightmare for the binder. There's not sufficient time here to go into detail, but our analysis demonstrated that though the Bowyer ledgers indicate that of the 70 4-leaf signatures in Volume 1, 38 contain cancellations, the watermarks show evidence of cancellation in 66. Many of these have examples of multiple cancellations, and we have found in Lyttelton's signatures where all 4 leaves are from different paper stocks. Chain lines prove crucial. We found signatures where the direction lines indicated single leaf cancels, but nonetheless, the watermarks prove they were in fact conjugate. This should give bibliographers pause for thought. There are certainly more than 200 separate cancels in Lyttelton's first volume alone. Only 3K, 3R, 3S, and 3X appear cancel-free. Appear is used advisedly, as there is the possibility that these 4 signatures may be examples of the practice reported by the Fowles Press of entire sheets being reprinted. In the matter of cancellation, Henry II may be seen as an outlier, but possibly not so far out as one might think. When Edmund Burke was writing his reflections on the Revolution in France, Tom Paine wrote to Thomas Christie to say, Mr. Burke was much at a loss how to go on, that he revised some of the sheets 6, 7, and 1 9 times. This is supported by Charles McCormick, who, writing within a decade of publication, reported that Burke wrote, blotted, rewrote, printed, cancelled, reprinted so often that when it appeared at length, it did not contain even one sheet of the original composition. It is therefore rather surprising that in his bibliography of Burke, William B. Todd only recorded 5 cancelled leaves in 26.5 sheets. It may be that, as at the Fowles Press, entire sheets were silently cancelled. It may be that, like Littleton, Burke was anxious not to have his constant havering made public and resorted to cancelled leaves tipped in. Todd noted that the reflections were printed on laid paper without watermarks. We would need to disbind a first edition and check all the chain lines in order to be certain of the true state of cancellation and be able to estimate the resulting waste. If anybody has a copy without boards, will they tell me? The demonstrable waste generated by Henry II was paralleled in the century by the commercial disaster that was the Bodleian Library Catalogue of 1738. Henry II waste was created in the printing house. There was some wastage during printing of the Bodleian Catalogue when the delegates got cold feet about quantity to be printed and reduced the run from 300 large folio and 2,000 small to 300 large and 500 small, thus generating 67 reams or 33,500 sheets of waste paper in the middle of printing. But it was the disparity between the expected and the actual sales which created a mountain of waste. In the first year of publication, the press sold 15 copies from their warehouse in Oxford. In the first 5 years, they sold a total of 11 large folio copies and 13 small. As Harry Carter recorded, in the next 5 years, they failed to sell a single copy. In an attempt to boost sales in 1758, prices were reduced to little avail. By 1785, 462 of the 800 copies remained in the warehouse. The press archives show that over the years, 162 copies have been given away. So sales in a period of 47 years were a miserable 166, fractionally over 3.5 per annum. This has rightly been described by Carter as a reflection on the literate world of the time. There was only one option. Accordingly, in 1785, the delegates, retaining only 20 small folios, ordered the remainder to be sold as waste paper immediately. The catalogues disposed of were in 2 volumes of 1,342 pages, a total of 148,291 sheets, to add to 33,500 wasted during printing. Unfortunately, the warehouseman's book does not record to whom these sheets were sold. Printed waste is frequently found in 17th century bindings, but less so in the 18th century when marble paper became much more the fashion. Printed waste, however, was still used for items regarded as ephemeral. As an example from the beginning of the century, the wrapper around this copy of Steele's Crisis comes from a malt book used by excisemen to record duty paid. As the Bowie ledgers show, these were printed in tens of thousands of copies at a time. At the other end of the century, the wrapper around a York poll book comes from a prospectus for Abraham Rees's revision of Chambers' Cyclopedia. Anthony Tedeschi found a similar fragment of Rees's prospectus in the binding of Volume 2 of Johnson's Dictionary in the Dunedin Public Library. We do not have details of the print run of this prospectus, but an educated estimate may be made by comparison with the numbers of the prospectuses for an earlier major part work, Tyndall's translation of Rapin's History of England, for which Strong printed 104,000 copies in a single run in 1758. Not one has survived. Rees's revision of Chambers was a major source of waste paper in the final decades of the century. Not only were there the unknown, but probably considerable number of prospectuses, there were also the wrappers round the individual parts. These appeared weekly, starting on the 31st of January, 1778, and there were 418 numbers. Richard Yeo has said that there were 4,000 to 5,000 copies of each part, which, if correct, would mean between 1,600,000 and well over 2 million wrappers. Those figures may be a trifle optimistic. All the evidence from part work publications suggests that numbers inevitably decrease. As Jack Lynch has recorded of Johnson's dictionary, which was published in 165 parts, the initial print run was 2,300, but by the halfway point, that had reduced to 800. Even with a similar relative decline, research chambers would still have produced over 500,000 waste wrappers. The STC being unavailable, a search of the JISC Discovery Hub suggests there are just 4 individual issues surviving in institutional libraries in the United Kingdom, and only 1 is recorded as having retained its wrapper. So it's not surprising to find recycled cyclopedia wrappers on a volume of 16th century sermons in the Folger Library, and on a volume of Gilbert Wakefield's edition of Pope's Poems, published in Warrington in 1784. As the previous owner indicates, this example is nicely ironic. Wakefield abandoned publication after volume 1. We heard that Joseph Warton was proposing to edit Pope. All unsold copies were sold off as waste paper. Given the prospectuses and part work wrappers for research chambers have been found on works newly printed in London, York, and Warrington, and in a rebinding of a collection of sermons dating from 2 centuries earlier, it seems reasonable to suppose this work constitutes the greatest source of wrappers and rebinding reworked from waste printed sheets in the final decades of the century, and we can expect to find many more examples. In a blog recording the discovery of the binding in the Folger Library, Elizabeth de Bold suggested that the binder attached the wrapper to the boards upside down and backwards, as can also be seen on Wakefield's Pope. But she added, without closer examination, I can't determine how the ink lies in the paper, which would help solve the issue. That her assumption is correct is demonstrated by a copy of Maitland's Ancient Scottish Poems of 1786, recently acquired from Maggs Brothers. A 2-volume set of this work came with 1 cover sheet attached, and the paste on the remaining covers had perished. Careful archaeobibliography revealed that they are indeed all reversed sheets. The boards have been covered with parts of wrappers from Edward Barnard's New and Complete History of England, published in 70 parts by Alexander Hogg. We have failed to locate any other examples of surviving wrappers. There are 2 details of admittedly minor interest. A letter from an unidentified bookseller relates to the transatlantic book trade. He has already sent 50 copies of Barnard's work to New York and wishes to send another 50. And there is an encomium from a Lady Parker of Portland Place, congratulating Barnard on producing a reference book, which can be read with instruction and entertainment by the female reader. Though the President made us aware in his lecture in March that such archaeobibliography is not now regarded as best practice, it is the only way in which the true extent of the Littleton cancels and the recycling of Barnard could have been established. We take some heart from the words of Henry Bradshaw, who wrote to Samuel Sanders, "As I examined the manuscript you were good enough to give us, I found it was so precious and so interesting that I could not resist the temptation of taking it to pieces, which I did with the utmost care and gentleness." And so did we. We're indebted to David McKittrick for that reference. It is likely that blue paper covered boards conceal a good deal of evidence of unsold or unknown works. Wrappers at recycling waste sheets can provide more bibliographical information. An unowned copy of A Cluster of Canaan's Grapes of 1772 is stab stitched in an outwardly plain blue wrapper. This proves to be a reversed wrapper, originally printed for a weekly artwork octavo Bible published by Isaac Moore in 1774. A publication not recorded in Darlow and Moore's extensive catalogue of editions of the Bible. There is no recorded surviving copy of any issue of this artwork. With a supplement to the Universal Magazine of Knowledge and Pleasure, published in June 1790, we have a slightly different case. This is in a dusky pink printed wrapper, This too has been recycled. The paper was originally intended to be the wraparound an issue of another part work, an octavo edition of the New Whole Duty of Man. As with More's Bible, of this work there are no surviving examples, but there are differences. Whereas the previous item was specifically for the 15th number of More's Weekly Bible, this is evidently a template for a wrapper. The space for the issue number has been left blank. We know there must have been at least 14 issues of More's Bible. There may never have been any issues of the New Whole Duty, possibly because demand was so poor it never got off the ground. A second example of a template being used as a wrapper is found on a copy of Old Aesop at Whitehall, giving advice to the young Aesops at Tunbridge and Bath, advertised in Justin Croft's California Fair catalogue in February. The wrapper is from an unnumbered template of a prospectus for Johnson's dictionary in parts, and can therefore be no earlier than 1755. The pamphlet itself was published in 1698. The examples we have seen of pamphlets with datable wrappers indicate that the cover was added at the transfer of printed sheets from the warehouse to the bookshop, which in this case would have been over 57 years after publication. Though this may seem a long time for an 18th century publisher or bookseller to keep stocks of a title, it is not. This example pales into insignificance compared with the publication history of the Oxford University Press edition of the Coptic Gospels, of which 500 were printed in October 1716, and the last copy was sold in the spring of 1907, 189 years later. But that was a substantial scholarly text. The evidence of this wrapper shows that even ephemeral items were kept in stock for lengths of time inconceivable to the modern market. At the Old Bailey in 1836, Francis Rivington testified, "We have had books in our warehouse 100 years, and we have evidence of substantial quantities of specifically waste sheets being kept for well over a century." From actual examples, we may move to documentary evidence. In the John Johnson collection in the Bodleian Library is a considerable holding of the catalogues of the auctions which took place following the death, retirement, or bankruptcy of a range of 18th century London booksellers. A notable feature of these catalogues is the frequency with which books are offered together with their waste, which demonstrates that those sheets which have been rejected by the printer and deemed waste were nonetheless perceived by the bookseller to be worth preserving, even given the cost of storage. An explanation for this preservation is to be found in letters in the Bodleian Library. On the 21st of April, 1693, Dr. Thomas Gale, the Dean of York, wrote to John Cross, a printer in Oxford, about Gale's account. He wanted to know how many copies of his work were yet unsold, and emphatically instructed Cross to preserve all the waste, for many books are found imperfect on collationing. Individual readers who found their purchase flawed would contact the author. As Samuel Mead wrote to Thomas Hearne in 1719, pointing out that his copy of William of Newburgh proves imperfect in the third volume. It wants the first 4 leaves, which is the sheet marked at the bottom with the letters 4G, and has instead of it a sheet marked at the bottom with letters 4H twice over. The bookbinder tells me it is possible that among the waste sheets, the sheet may be found. Mead's bookbinder was correct. Hearne found a replacement sheet, and Mead returned the duplicate. This punctilious returning of the extra sheets would have allowed Hearne to make good any copy which lacked the Mead duplication. When the following year Mead subscribed to Hearne's edition of A Collection of Curious Discourses, a similar problem occurred, leading to another request, this time involving 2 omitted signatures. Mead had noticed the missing sheet shortly after acquiring the books. Other readers took rather longer. In 1713, Dr. John Woodward asked Hearne to arrange for the university printer to supply a number of omitted sections in a copy of Morrison's Plantarum Historiae Universalis Oxoniensis, which he had given to Dr. Robert Sibbald of Edinburgh. Woodward commented, "I presented the books to him and gave a great price for them, so that 'tis pity, but they should be perfect." Morrison's work had been published 23 years before. Hearne nevertheless managed to lay copies of the missing sheets within 4 months. In the same year, Hearn himself was given a book by Richard Rawlinson, which proved defective. He wrote to Rawlinson to say, "The title page and maps are wanting in Norden, but you need not give yourself the trouble of procuring them for me." This was a magnanimous gesture in view of the fact that the book concerned was either John Norden's Direction for the English Traveller, the most recent edition of which had appeared in 1677, 36 years earlier, or the same author's England An Intended Guide, of which the sole edition had been published in 1625, 88 years before. Hearn's magnanimity may be perceived as bordering on the comical, but there is an important point here. There was an expectation that the printed sheets could be found among preserved wastes more than 80 years after publication. The John Johnson collection adds another dimension to this. Thomas Warner of the Black Boy Paternoster Row died in 1734, and in the collection are to be found 2 catalogues following his death. A catalogue of the stock of Mr. Thomas Warner deceased, containing his books in quires, pamphlets, and copies, and the remaining part of Mr. Warner's stock containing his bound books, pamphlets, waste paper, copies, etc. Perversely, there is no waste paper listed in the second auction, though there is much of interest in the first. Given the practice identified in the Boyer and Strawn ledgers of printers sending all the waste back with the final tranche of the printed text, one would expect to find in the Warner sales examples of his own commissioned works together with their waste. To take just one example, was 857, Proposal for Regulating Pawnbrokers and Waste. This is Proposals for Regulation or Entire Suppression of Pawnbrokers, printed for T. Warner at the Black Boy, Paternoster Row, 1732. Though the greater part of the lots in the 2 Warner sales which are sold with waste are similar examples of waste with Warner's name in the imprint, this is not always the case. Lot 840, Occasional Paper Extraordinary, is followed by 841, Ditto Waste. And lot 945 is Seasonable Apology for Mr. Heidegger about masquerades and waste. The first of these is the Occasional Writer Extraordinary to Caleb Danvers, Esquire, and a late noble lord by an unknown hand, of which the imprint reads, printed for A. Moore, near St. Paul's Churchyard, 1727. And the second, a Seasonable Apology for Mr. Heidegger, proving the usefulness and antiquity of masquerading from scripture and profane history, printed for A. Moore, near St. Paul's, 1724. The STC records no fewer than 424 items published between 1700 and 1734 with the imprint A. Moore. It was one of the most frequently used pseudonyms employed, and the subject matter of a publication might have been interpreted as contentious, possibly liable to prosecution for breach of parliamentary privilege, political libel, obscenity, or causing religious offence. It is rare to be able to identify the real commissioning party, but the fact that the deceased bookseller had the waste is a very strong indication that in these 2 cases at least, A. Moore equals T. Warner. There's a further complication. Lots 875 and 876 offer for sale Phillips's Dissertationes Vari Argumenti, octavo, and Ditto Waste. This is the second edition of Jenkin Thomas Phillips's Dissertationes, John Baker and Joseph Archer, 1715. The STC records 5 titles published in 1717 with a publication line associating John Baker with Thomas Warner at the Black Boy and Paternoster Row, after which Baker vanishes. And this appears to have been the year in which Warner, having taken over the business, also acquired the stock, which included titles to which Baker had been preserving the waste. Just as it was possible to identify Warner as A. Moore in the 2 titles previously discussed, so it is possible to identify Baker as responsible for 2 publications which appeared with neither place nor name of bookseller on the title page. Lot 211, Hamden's Trial, folio, waste of 1 small paper, refers to a speech by Richard Hamden, Esquire, at the trial of the Earl of Wintoun, 1716. Lot 930 is the Cheverell's speech, 2 half sheets with 5 quires of waste, must be Dr. Henry Sir Cheverell's speech made in Westminster Hall, 1710. Both works For safety's sake, were published anonymously, but the location of the waste identifies the commissioning bookseller as John Baker. Where sales catalogues are priced, it's clear that lots containing unspecified waste paper or only waste paper did not sell. In the auction following the death of Timothy Hatchett in 1737, 3 successive lots are revealing. Lot 269, Simon Patrick's A Commentary upon the Historical Books of the Old Testament, sold for £1.11. And 271, Patrick and Louth's commentaries, 4 volumes, went for £3. The sandwiched lot, 270, 3 Patrick's commentaries, 2 volumes imperfect, with a large parcel of waste, failed to find a buyer. The quantities of waste paper which accumulated and the lack of desire in the book trade to acquire more than what inevitably came direct from the printer, most clearly seen at the auction of Francis Gosling's stock in 1742, where in a highly successful sale, which found buyers for almost every lot, 2 offerings conspicuously failed. Lot 12, 269 reams of large crown waste paper, and lot 13, 75 reams of demi-waste, a total of 172,000 sheets. These examples strongly suggest that lots including waste paper represent reliable identification of a publishing bookseller or his or her predecessor at the same premises. There is no evidence of a bookseller buying waste paper unless the lot also included the copyright. It is clear that throughout literate society in early 18th century England, from the author, the printer, the bookbinder, and the bookseller to the reader, there was an expectation of imperfection, and at the same time, there was a belief in perfectibility. Preserving waste was the intelligent norm in this system. Another invaluable, readily available online source of information about waste paper is to be found in the record of trials of the Old Bailey. During the 18th century, over 100 defendants were charged with stealing paper, mainly to sell to shopkeepers as wrapping. Juries developed an aversion to bringing in verdicts of guilty in many of these cases, where the claimed value of the paper stolen would have resulted in the death penalty. They resorted to pious perjury, partial, and occasionally downright perverse verdicts. To counter this tendency, the prosecutors provided increasingly specific descriptions of the paper stolen, and some of these indictments and the accompanying testimony provide unexpected bibliographical details. In 1765 appeared 2 9th editions of Rowe's Tragedy of Jane Shore. Both were published for Lowndes, Caslon, and Nichols. Why? Possibly because Elizabeth Homel had stolen, among other items, 700 sheets of the title page of this work from the printer James Emerson to sell for waste. This prosecution names the previously unidentified printer and may explain the existence of 2 variant 9th editions. Blair versus Devine, which was heard on the 11th of September 1745, is the classic exemplar of a trial for stealing paper to sell as waste. It was an inside job. A considerable quantity of paper was stolen, and we learned the thief's method. The theft was from a shared warehouse, and discovery was both serendipitous and took place a considerable time after the first quantities of paper had been stolen. We know to whom the paper was sold, and are given details of the practice of selling on. We are told of the prosecutor's estimate of the value of the paper, the price the thief actually received, and, uniquely, the amount for which the paper left in the warehouse was sold on the legal market, thus providing clear evidence of the advantage to an unscrupulous retailer of buying on the black market. The indictment provides a detailed description of the paper, which allows us to solve a minor bibliographical puzzle, and the jury brought in a partial verdict in combination with an element of pious perjury. Philip Devine stole somewhere in the region of 36,000 sheets of paper, printed paper, by the simple expedient of cutting them into small pieces, which he could smuggle out of the warehouse in his pockets and his shirt, thus evading the notice of the warehouse keeper, who testified, had he carried never so little a thing openly, I must have seen it as he came out. Discovery was fortuitous and the result of the practice of selling on. Divine's wife had sold considerable quantities of the paper to two shopkeepers, one of whom sold on at a profit some of the surplus sheets to a glover named Avery. That shopkeeper, William Roberts, had bought the paper in November 1744, 9 months before Blair had discovered his loss. This is typical. Leaving aside cases of opportunistic thieves caught red-handed, evidence at trials throughout the century shows there was usually a lengthy gap between theft and discovery. Several stationers and printers testified they had so much paper in their warehouses they could have lost several thousand reams before they would have noticed. Blair's wife decided that her muffetees needed to be dyed and sent them to Avery. The newly fashioned hand warmers were returned wrapped in a piece of paper from her husband's stock, which he immediately recognized. Ludicrous though this may seem, it is not a unique example of fortuitous discovery. On 3 occasions, a thief was apprehended as a result of butter being bought and then wrapped in paper originally owned by the purchaser. Once, stolen paper was identified in the very act of being used to wrap ham. And on one occasion, the paper was recognized in a cheesemonger's shop by a bookseller's agent who had previously sold the sheets to the unsuspecting victim of the crime. At the trial, the indictment was very specific. Philip Divine of St. Martin's in the Fields was indicted for stealing 150 complete sets of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th volumes of the Roman history by Ozell of the value of £30. 400 sheets being part of the 5th and 6th volumes, value £3, and 200 books of the 4th volume, value £10, the goods of Francis, privately in the warehouse, said Francis. One problem is that despite the apparent precision of this indictment, the details are not as helpful as they first appear. Ozell was an indefatigable translator. A polyglot, he translated, among others, Homer, Ovid, Rabelais, Cervantes, Corneille, Racine, Molière, Montesquieu, von Pufendorf, and Alberti. So indefatigable was he, in fact, that he translated 2 different histories of Rome in the 1720s, one by the Abbé Vertot and one by Catrou and Rouillet. In their stealing books in the 18th century London, Holton, Morgan, and Reed identify the text stolen by Divine as the translation by Vertot. This identification is wrong. Vertot was always printed in 2 volumes. Blair testifies to the loss of 6. To add to the problem, Ozell's translation of Catrou and Rouillet, according to the STC, was in 4 volumes. How can this be reconciled? But by 1745, 4 volumes had been published. Blair's testimony made clear that a further 2 volumes had been printed, but not put on sale. As a result of Divine's depredations, not a single copy of either of these 2 volumes has survived. Moreover, as the indictment makes clear, Divine stole 150 copies each of volumes 1 to 3 and 350 copies of volume 4. This partly explains why the STC records only 2 surviving copies of volume 1, 2 copies of volume 2, 3 of volume 3, and a single copy of volume 4 at Göttingen, the only library to have a complete set, which fits neatly with the indictment details. It is a minor problem of bibliographical nomenclature to decide how to describe volumes 5 and 6. They had an existence, but do not survive, and are seen only fleetingly in the Old Bailey records, which might suggest the word ghost, had that word not already been appropriated by George Watson Cole for editions of work that never existed. Faced with overwhelming evidence of Divine's guilt, the jury nevertheless came to a partial verdict allied with pious perjury, the indictment being for stealing them in the warehouse of Francis Blair, and it appearing they were stolen in the warehouse of Charles Calne. He was acquitted of privately stealing in the warehouse, which is a capital offence, and found guilty of felony only. He was transported to North America for 7 years. I should like to conclude with a puzzle. In the middle years of the 18th century, it became fashionable to decorate one's house with papier-mâché ornaments. The fashion was not restricted to England. It was very popular in Dublin, and in North America, where both Benjamin Franklin and George Washington had papier-mâché ceilings. A surprising number of these schemes survive. There were great advantages over stucco. The raw materials were cheaper. The decorations could be bought off the shelf, and they did not require the employment of stuccadores, being essentially DIY. Individual pieces were tacked to the ceiling or wall and could be very easily moved around. In 1751, William Shenstone loaned Lady Luxborough a papier-mâché pineapple, which he had taken down from his ceiling so that she could see how it would appear were she to acquire one for her drawing room. These pieces were made in two principal ways: by having a mould into which was pressed pulped paper, or by layering fragments of sheets. In the first case, the origin of the paper cannot be determined, but in the latter, the text remains partly intact. Here we see the reverse of a decorative rosette originally installed in 1747. It is made from 8 separate printed fragments, most of which can be more or less specifically identified. For example, there is part of an advertisement for a very, very small dog, which was taken from page 4 of the Daily Advertiser of the 10th of November, 1744. The real interest is in the central backing fragment, which is printed in German and on much heavier paper than the other pieces. The text below the rule is advice on how to avoid having your pockets picked by the simple expedient of setting mouse traps in them. This appears to be adapted from an anthology of humorous anecdotes collected by Simon Dach under the pseudonym Chas Mindo, of which several editions were printed in Germany before 1700. But the text here does not tally with any edition we have located. Moreover, the thematically unrelated text above the rule, which seems to be concerned with medical treatment based upon astrological divination, has entirely eluded us. How this piece of paper found its way into an English papier-mâché decoration remains a mystery. Where, when, and by whom was this leaf printed? Of which book was it a part? Was it a book imported for the amusement of a member of the Hanoverian court in London? Was it a book a German publisher failed to sell and exported or exchanged for a possibly equally unsellable English text? Could it be evidence of an international trade in waste paper? As with so many elements of the waste paper trade in the 18th century, we can only say, we do not know.